Welcome to South Coast Matters. My name is Paul Latendra.
And I'm Julie Taylor. And South Coast Matters is a public access television show where we bring together civic leaders, business leaders, and citizens to discuss how we can work in harmony to have a positive impact on our South Coast communities.
Before we introduce today's guest, I'd like to hear something from the voice of God, a.k.a. Peter McDonald. Could we hear?
From the South Coast Insider of March 2015 is the following quote. The most important need is to prepare our residents to understand and embrace inevitable changes. We must educate ourselves to learn to think critically, solve problems, and communicate effectively. It's not rocket science that will ensure a better future. It's the same solution as it has always been. Good fundamental education and lifelong learning will make us adaptable and competitive as we prepare to harness the many new dynamics of our future economy. Close quote, Steve Smith.
There are two reasons we played that quote. First reason is the quote's very in tune with what we're trying to achieve here on this show, The South Coast Matters. And the second reason is that the author of that quote is today's guest, Stephen Smith.
So Steve is the recently retired Executive Director of SRPEDD, the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District. And that was a position he held since 1983. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and now that I'm retired, maybe I can say things I wouldn't have said when I was still employed. And
please do, yeah, we like that
trouble,
stuff.
I can do that. But as you said, I was Executive Director of SRPEDD. That's the unpronounceable acronym from Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District. And in the 32 years I was director there, the question I dreaded most is, what is it you do? What does that agency do? Because they could take up your whole time explaining that.
Is that why you kept the name so long, so that you could kill?
I would have loved to have changed the name, frankly. But I guess think of it this way. In most of the country, we have counties. In Massachusetts, we have counties, but they really are shells there. They do some basic court functions and some prison functions in there, the state. But in other parts of the country, counties are quite viable and bring local communities together to do things and have certain authority to do jobs that cities and towns don't have. We don't really have that in Massachusetts, so the closest thing I could say SRPEDD is a county. Now, we don't have authority to run certain programs, but planning, there are 6 words, not counting the "and" in our name, and every one of them has some meaning. Southeastern talks about the part of the state we address, and it's 27 cities and towns with a population of about 600,000 people. Regional says we address things that cities and towns don't address on their own, but have to go across municipal boundaries.
Could we show that picture of the cities and towns that it represents?
Sure.
You can keep talking while
So
he's...
if you're looking at the picture, you can see we cover an area basically from the Cape Cod Canal over to Rhode Island and north to basically 495, a little bit north of 495. So it's at the northern boundary. We're talking about North Attleboro and Mansfield, and at the southern extreme, it's Wareham and Carver and Marion, and then over to the Rhode Island border and so forth.
You don't take in Plymouth, though.
We used to, but there was a political dispute years ago, and Plymouth left. So it's 4 cities. It's Attleboro, Taunton, Fall River, New Bedford, and 23 towns, the smallest of which, Berkeley, is one of the smaller ones. Berkeley, Marion, Mattapoisett, which are about 5,000 people, Rochester. So it's a range of communities, and that's the region we serve. Planning speaks to what we spend most of our time doing, which is thinking about the future. What's going to happen in this region, how cities and towns need to work together to address issues and plan for them. Economic Development District comes from old federal legislation. Actually, we were set up under the EDA, and it tells us we have an economic function as well. So, but we are created by, it's a hybrid agency in the sense we're created by the state legislature, which set up 13 comparable agencies around the state. We're funded primarily by the federal government, although a lot of the money, most of the money from the federal government comes through state agencies, and most of it is in transportation. And we're governed by local officials. So the 27 cities and towns are represented by either the mayor or the Board of Selectmen representative and a planning board representative, and that's our governing body. So we have this accountability to the cities and towns, but we have accountability to the feds and the states because they pay a lot of the money.
So you had a lot of different sets of rules and regs to...
Absolutely. We have about, I should say, I have to speak of this past tense because I
Yeah.
did retire as of June 30th, but about as many as 24 different contracts with state agencies, federal agencies, cities and towns, colleges, some foundations, to do different work. About half of that relates to transportation. We do a lot in transportation. And you do where the money is, and that's where the money is. But economic development, environment, housing, zoning, and something we could talk about a little bit is getting cities and towns to work together to save money and actually do some of the municipal functions on a regional basis. So are you thoroughly confused now in terms of...
Well, I'm getting there. Were you ever in a situation where if you did something, you couldn't do it without being illegal on one side of the border? Could you do something in Attleboro, but in Taunton, if you did it to benefit Attleboro, it would be against Taunton?
I wouldn't say illegal, but I would say often, and more often than not, things don't get done because they're not in the interest of every community. Water supply, for example, some towns host reservoirs and other towns take that water and they're always fighting over that. That's an issue right now with the Lakeville ponds between the communities that own that. So frequently there are conflicts. There are conflicts over SouthCoast Rail where communities to the north of us don't want it because they don't want trains running through their town, and communities to the south do. So yes, conflict is really part of what I do, and casinos are another one. You know, a classic example where some communities will benefit tax-wise financially, but other communities will get all the bad spin-off effects and get nothing out of it. So, and this...
I'll back you up on the casinos just for a minute.
Sure.
In today's coastalmags.com is I published it last night, your article on you wouldn't bet on a Taunton casino.
Yeah.
I did change the title.
Oh.
Steve and I have done work. We've met today, but we've done work for the same magazine for a lot of years. And you've been with her for 15 years,
Yeah,
16
it's
years.
been that long.
Yeah, I've been around South Coast Insider for 5 or 6 years. So.
Yep. Well, my take on the casino is we've always had a role of not pro-casino or anti-casino, but helping cities and towns deal with the impacts if a casino comes, and making that decision, making the right decision, working with the gaming
Roads,
commission.
housing, and
Yeah. Now it was a sort of the way the state law was set up was a battle between Brockton and New Bedford for the casino here. New Bedford pulled out, so the Region C was going to go to default to Brockton, and then the federal government, to everyone's surprise, I think, said, well, the Wampanoags, yeah, maybe we will let them take that land in trust in Taunton, and they're not subject to the same rules that the Massachusetts casinos would be. So that's a real issue where you've got potentially a big casino. Whether it will go ahead or not is another matter. But a big casino proposed at a place that has horrible traffic problems already, and unlike the state law, which had a process whereby surrounding communities were designated and certain benefits and mitigation could flow to those communities, that isn't in place in the federal situation with the Indians. So it's much more different and much more complicated. So we'll see how that plays out. But
there is one other complication to that deal as well, and I'm not sure how much that has been played up in the paper, but the compact that was negotiated with the state and the Indians provides the state a certain amount of revenue from the casino. But if they were to put another commercial casino in the area, then that agreement for the funding stops.
Right.
So that's a
So
little
that's the
complicated wrinkle.
Well, under the state law, I think, say the casino's licensed in Brockton, they pay 25% of their revenues to the state. The agreement, compact negotiated with the Wampanoags, I think it was 17%. They weren't, that was actually a deal that they struck a deal and then the courts didn't approve it, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs said it was too generous to the state and they lowered the money 17. But it says that if the Brockton Casino or a commercial casino is to open, that 17 goes to 0. So, and that is the money that would help the towns around. Taunton has cut a deal with the, they've got some intersections, they've got, I think, $8 million a year or some money coming to them. But everyone else is out in the cold in terms of what happens, and yet they're all impacted by it. So I don't want to get too far afield, but the intersection of Route 24 and 140 is a real bottleneck between Fall River, New Bedford, and Metro Boston.
Yeah.
And anyone drives through it in the morning can see that, whether you're coming. And I believe there are plans to address that. The state was doing something before the casino was approved, but they're talking, as many as maybe 25,000 cars a day in addition going to that casino, most of whom will pass through that interchange. So it's a real long-term problem that's got to be addressed. And that's not talking about potential accidents on Route 24 that in other towns where ambulances have to go respond to it and things like that.
What 24 is, do you know the traffic patterns, how they compare now as to where they were in like 1990, 1980?
Well, how about when he first became executive director in 1983?
There were probably 12 cars a day on Route 24 in those days.
I wish I could give you those numbers off the top of my head. I want to say they've doubled. I don't think it's quite that, but they can go to the SRPEDD website, by the way, SRPEDD.org, and get traffic counts on any of these roads going back 10, 20 years. And there's no question the traffic on Route 24 is just continue to grow. It dropped off a little bit during the recession in the 2008, 2009, but it's back up there. And but you don't need a traffic count. What do they say, Dylan? You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. Yeah. You don't need a traffic count to know how congested Route 24 is in the morning and in the evening. And
this morning, for example, they had that accident that shut down between 2 exits. And just going to Lakeville from Berkeley was crazy. All the cars that got off. It's just, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, I heard it was a total stoppage.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, one of the arguments of SouthCoast Rail. Should I launch off on the...
Yeah, go ahead.
SouthCoast Rail is, I guess, a transportation project at its heart. I think of it as so much more than a transportation project, but it will take significant traffic off at peak hours off Route 24, remove cars, which has environmental benefits, it has congestion benefits, because a lot of those cars driving up Route 24 are going the same destinations that would be served by SouthCoast Rail. So that would be one of the benefits, not counting things like investment in the cities where there are train stations and so forth, which would be enormous. But just the traffic advantage would be enormous.
Just the legacy we'd leave our children by giving them that. I feel that our forefathers gave us Route 24. They gave us a highway system, the Eisenhower highway system. And we've utilized the hell out of it during our lifetimes. And we beat the crap out of it, too, without really renovating it, so to speak. And there's really no room to, I don't think there's room for another Route 24 side by side with it.
No.
And I think the legacy we're leaving our children is considerably less than what we were left with.
But then the people on the other side will also say, and we've heard it from one of our own members here in our group, that when you take a car off the road to go, someone takes the train, they're just going to put another one on. So it's like a one-for-one, and you're really not going to mitigate the traffic problem. And then that's also the cost. That there's no need to spend $2 billion. We can do it much less using existing rail lines.
The cost is big, and it's obviously the biggest obstacle at South Coast Rail. But you know, when we talk about cost on any infrastructure, or for that matter, any government investment, we should be talking about cost benefit. And we don't talk about the benefit, we only talk about the cost. And $2 billion is a lot of money, but there are a lot of jobs. There are 3,800 jobs directly associated with that project that will come to this region. There are another 7,000 to 8,000 construction jobs. Around the train station, they project between, I think, 6,500 and 8,500 units of housing for people who may not want to have a car, want to live near a train station, walk to the station and hop on it and go to work. We have incredible housing stock and opportunities in our region that should be accessible to Boston people because they're a whole lot more affordable than the units in Boston, as I know, because I'm trying to sell a house.
Sure.
And so the cost is high for sure, but the benefits are enormous, and we have to weigh that against, there's an equity issue. When MBTA runs 11 commuter rail lines, and I know Gene Fox was a guest on your show, and I'm sure you heard this from Gene. But MBTA runs 11 commuter rail lines with 121 stations, I think. And Taunton, Fall River, and New Bedford are the only 3 cities in eastern Massachusetts that don't have rail service, commuter rail service. And you know, if for no other, they owe us this. I mean, there are a lot of good reasons. There are a lot of good economic reasons. There are environmental reasons. There are land use reasons and so forth. But probably the strongest argument is one of equity. That, you know, Southeastern Mass has always gotten the short end of the stick on investment and infrastructure investment, and this would really be a great make-up call.
We were speaking with a New Bedford City Councilor in our last show, Dana Ribeiro, and we talked very briefly about how people in New Bedford at one point, what was it, 10 years ago, so most of them worked in the area, and now that is switched. Now they mostly have to go out of the area to work. So how would the South Coast Rail help economically the cities of Fall River and New Bedford, since they have such high unemployment? And how would that help them economically?
Oh, it helped. I was just looking. The Fall River and New Bedford ranked 347th and 349th out of 351 cities and towns in terms of income in the state. I was trying to figure out who was below.
I checked that over the weekend, and
Lawrence,
yeah, we're under 50 grand per family household in Fall River and New Bedford, and Taunton too's down there.
Yeah. So I mean, access to jobs for one thing, access for people. You know, frankly, one of the things that's not talked about with something like commuter rail is it's not a project that really is directed toward poor people. It's a project directed toward middle class people who want to commute to tend to be professional jobs, and those people have left the cities. They've left Fall River and left New Bedford, and for the sake of the school system and the communities, they really need to bring the middle class people back into the city as residents, and the rail will do some of that, and that people may say, well, that sounds like gentrification to some extent. You know, you have to make provisions for affordable housing, but it really should change investment patterns in those cities and really lift them up significantly. So
that's a great point, because I don't think I've heard that point made either. And we talk so much about how the city schools, Fall River, New Bedford, prime examples, are really in tough straits trying to get decent education for their kids. But like you said, if you bring the middle class back in, they're going to demand that a certain level of education is provided to the children. So, you know, that's a good point.
To give you a sense of how a transportation investment can be transformational, when I started this job in 1983, 495 did not exist between Route 24 and Route 95. It's a 13-mile link. It was under construction, but the section through Raynham and Taunton and Norton and Mansfield didn't exist. The city of Taunton unemployment rate was about 14% in 1982-83. It was the same as Fall River. If you look at statistics, it was indistinguishable from Fall River and New Bedford. And 495 was complete, and the Miles Standish Industrial Park was started. And the first, I think they had a Pepsi-Cola distribution facility as their first. And that was in the early 1980s. And now they employ close to 7,000 people up there with about 100 firms. And it has just made an enormous difference in that city's economic outlook. And without 495, that would not have happened. So that was a transportation investment that really made an enormous difference in that city.
I bring up this example. I brought it up in some other shows, but the whole Eisenhower highway system basically was justified through defense funding. These highways were going to be used as emergency landing strips for airplanes, et cetera, and to move arms back and forth. But we've built an economy. That's the backbone of our economy, is the highway system.
And you know what's interesting about that, when SRPEDD, Southeastern Regional Planning, the agency I used to work for, celebrated our 50th anniversary, our 50th birthday, it was in 2006. It was actually, and it was organized in 1956 as it was a predecessor, it was a different organization, but basically the same thing. The same year as the interstate highway system was passed. And I always thought that was kind of relevant. We invested a lot, and those bridges now, the interstate highway system is 50 years old. 50 bridges are starting to fall down, and we can't get anything done in Congress. We can't get a transportation bill passed to just invest, just to maintain what we have, and we have certainly needs to expand. And it's almost embarrassing other parts of the world and other countries and how sophisticated their transportation networks are and how much they invest in it. And we're barely able to maintain this great highway system we built more than 50 years ago.
Well, it's good that you brought that up, because that was one thing I wanted to talk about, since we have a few minutes left in this segment, that we can talk about the transportation funding from the federal government. And why is it so difficult for the Congress to pass something long-term so we can count on revenues, and why is it we can't do something with a gas tax or something in order to fund this? Why is that so difficult?
You know, and it goes a little bit, the SRPEDD is organized around the principle that we're all in this together and we have to share, and there may be winners and losers, but overall helping the region helps the whole thing.
Right.
In Congress, a lot of the debate over transportation funding has been, my state doesn't get as much as I put in. They pay more into the gas tax than they get out, you know, and there's an inequity issue, and we don't trust the federal government, and it's a shared responsibility, a shared investment, and they just don't seem to be willing to do that anymore. Everyone's like, we'll do our thing in our state. And you don't build an interstate highway system a state at a time. You know, you've got to organize and work together to do that. But seems to be this loss of shared values and shared destiny that the interstate highway system, when they first conceived, represented. We were in this together, we got to do this together. And it did have a national defense component, as you mentioned. But we seem to have lost this, and it's all become everybody for themselves.
So if it's been talked about that, each state should keep their gas tax revenue instead of giving it to the federal government, then what happens to rural states like Wyoming or, you know, Nevada or something? I mean, how would they even keep up with their infrastructure, and how would that affect us economically across the country?
How would Iowa have their primaries?
Yeah, I mean, well, at least Iowa's got some bigger cities, but you're right. I mean, that just seems ludicrous. And when you say we're all in this together.
Then the other issue is it's a whole lot older, the transportation network in some parts of the country. Well, not so much interstate highway system, but certainly rail and other things than in other parts of the country. And we face, as we learned last winter, we face weather challenges which put more stress on our transportation network than they do in Arizona, for example. So there are all kinds of issues that are inequitable, and we just have to kind of bite the bullet and say.
How old are the rails now that freight's running on across?
SouthCoast Rail, there used to be passenger trains running until 1958, where SouthCoast Rail. The tracks, and now those tracks mostly only carry freight. And I think they're limited to about 10 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour, because the tracks are just so unsafe. They have these old wooden ties that are rotted away, the spikes are gone, so forth. So I mean, one of the things that's being done sort of quietly in advance of SouthCoast Rail is do upgrading of some of those tracks so that the freight trains can move a little bit better. But I doubt there's been any investment in at least 50 years or longer in some of those sections of track.
Then you think of your own house, if you didn't touch it for 50 years, what it would look like. So it seems kind of silly we haven't planned for these things.
No. Well, we plan for them, but then the
Funding.
planners.
Yeah, right. You're doing your
Well, yeah,
job.
we're saying, I mean, we're saying that, for example, we need to widen Route 24 between 140 and 495 to 3 lanes because where 140 comes in, it just jams up every morning, and there's a strong argument to make. So the planners are making that case, but to spend the money and to get it done and get it approved by everyone is just an enormous job, and we're competing for a shrinking pie.
How long ago did you have that plan?
Well, that was probably first. That one isn't that old, but when I say it wasn't that old, it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. You know, so, I mean, some of these ideas go back a lot longer. South Coast Rail goes back to Michael Dukakis in the 1980s when I first went director at SRPEDD, and sometimes I think we're not a whole lot further along than that, but that has an interesting history, which I could.
We're running out of time on this show, but we do want to get you back for a second show.
Love to do it.
And one of the things I'd like you to think about is, it's a pet peeve of mine, I'd love to know what you think this area will look like in 20, 40 years from now, with and without the rail, and how that will make a difference.
This is my Back to the Future moment.
Back to the future, yeah. You're pretty good at going backwards. I'll ask you to go forward.
Sure, I'd like to do that.
In the next show. Anything else we want to?
No, we've got a lot of things we can continue in another segment to kind of build on what we've already talked about in the future vision of the South Coast.
And one thing I'd like to go over too is the income inequity in the towns versus some of our cities. Marion, I think they average $120,000 per household, and Fall River, we're down to 3. We're out of time. Thank you, Steve Smith, for joining us today. I'm Paul Latendra, and we appreciate you being with us at South Coast Matters.
And I'm Julie Taylor, and look for us on Facebook under South Coast Matters, and we welcome our comments, your comments at our email, southcoastmatters@gmail.com. And next week's guest will be Senator Mark Pacheco.
Good. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.